Hello and welcome to this new video on actual spirit. Today I will present an introduction to my paper in the anthology Abyssal Arrows called The Birth of the Spirit Child. The subtitle to Abyssal Arrows is Spiritual Leadership Inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this anthology comes from a course by Philosophy Portal that students as well as other people in the course have worked through. Today we will be talking about Chapter 7, which contains my paper on the birth of the Spirit Child, and the second interlude, which is my debut single, God's Love, under the name Objet Lil A. First, we're going to start going into the genesis of spirit. The following quote is by Hegel from the Encyclopedic Logic. The first reflection that occurred to the awakening consciousness was the realization by these human beings that they were naked. This is a very naive and profound feature, for in this feeling of shame lies the divorce of human beings from their natural sensory being. The animals who do not progress to this divorce are for that reason shameless. As a result, the spiritual and ethical source of clothing is to be sought in the human feeling of shame. Now, on the right, we can see a painting that Adam and Eve are being expulsed from the Garden of Eden. And we can see that Eve is covering over her breasts and her genitals, having a shame for being a bodily entity, and Adam covering over his face and having a shame for his spiritual nature. Now, the first reflection that came along with the genesis of spirit is the realization of the naked truth, which consequently they must cover over. This encounter is traumatic and must be obfuscated by the feeling of shame, which looks away or attempts to cover over this naked truth. Like Hegel says in the previous slide, the animals do not come to the genesis of spirit since they are completely shameless and do not have the reflection from which that shame comes. The following quote is by Zizek from Absolute Recoil. He says, "Before eating from the tree, the two were already naked. They just didn't know that they were. One can imagine them doing a double take. The shift involved in the fall is thus purely subjective. It involves Adam and Eve adopting a different attitude towards themselves. They merely realize, register, take note of what they are. What betrayed them to God was not their brash display of nakedness, but their feeling of shame at realizing that they were naked. One can thus say that it was the moral feeling of shame that itself made them guilty." So, in this passage by Zizek, it is clear that Adam and Eve were naked before they realized that they were. And the fall of mankind is exactly the same as the genesis of spirit. Now, in this quote, Zizek says that shame itself makes one guilty. That feeling retroactively posits guilt. To summarize, the genesis of spirit consists of a divorce from natural being, of a self-reflection that entails shame about the naked truth, and that therefore must be covered over. Now we will go into the history of spirit. Zarathustra, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, says, "The human itself is for the knower the animal with red cheeks. How did it become like this? Is it not because he has had to shame himself too often? O friends, thus speaks the knower. Shame, shame, shame. That is the history of the human." So we can see that the genesis of spirit, or the fall of mankind, it leads us to the history of spirit, which consists of nothing but shame, shame, and shame, according to Zarathustra. Shame is, of course, a loss of innocence, and again, that moral feeling of shame retroactively posits a guilt, which leads us to want to hide, to retract, in the face of the judgment of the other's gaze, which could be God. And in that feeling of shame, we are being guilty of being bodily as well as spiritual. Now we will go into what goes beyond this shame. Hegel in the Encyclopedic Logic says the following: childlike innocence does indeed possess something attractive and touching, but only insofar as it reminds us of what is supposed to be brought about by spirit. That natural oneness that we witness in children is supposed to be the result of the work and education of the spirit. Christ says, unless you become like children, etc. in Matthew 18:2-4. This does not mean, however, that we should remain children. Of course, the opposite of shame, the opposite of guilt, would be innocence. And as we know, children do emanate this innocence, which we find very attractive and touching. But this should only give us a glimpse of what we in turn as spirit can bring about by work and education. Just like Jesus Christ, Hegel agrees that the task is not to remain children and to aim to retain that innocence, but to lose it and afterwards work and educate oneself to come to a spiritual level of innocence. Along with Jesus Christ and Hegel, Zarathustra agrees on the endpoint of children and only children being able to enter the kingdom of heaven. Zarathustra says, innocence is the child, and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-turning wheel, a first movement, a holy yes-saying. Yes, the game of creation, brethren, requires a holy yes. His spirit wills his own will now. The worldless one creates his own world. The child and the spirit child, or that is, the child understood in a spiritual manner beyond the naturalness of the organic child, is innocence and entails a new beginning, a game. What exactly is the nature of this child, I will go into later. And it is clear that Nietzsche, Hegel, and Jesus Christ agree on the importance of this spiritual child. They all agree that nature's child is lost forever, and that one should not lament this, should not be nostalgic for this loss. This new child can be birthed by spirit, but only through work and education. According to Zarathustra, it is the last metamorphosis of spirit, after the camel, which carries the heaviness of the world, and the lion, which breaks free from that heaviness that the camel carries. The lion, however, cannot create his own world, and even though the lion possesses a passionate heart to break free from the heaviness and from the burden that the camel can only carry, it is only the child that goes beyond shame, beyond pity, and wills its own will as one who creates his own world by being worldless and rootless, but taking this up as the truth of one's actuality in a reconciliation with concrete existence as it is, in a holy yes-saying, or what Nietzsche would call amor fati. The child is innocent, attractive, and shameless. Now we will go into the work and the education of spirit. And two things that we must work with here are shame and pity. Zarathustra says, and this is why the noble one asks of himself not to shame. He carries shame for himself for everything that suffers. Verily, I do not like them, the merciful one, who delights in his pity. They lack shame too much. What is the nature of pity? In German, as well as in Dutch, pity could literally be translated as co-suffering, Mitleid in German and Medelijden in Dutch. It is a suffering that sees another suffering and wallows in its contagiousness. However, according to Zarathustra, this is a delighting in pity, and one must actually carry a shame for this pity. Now remember that the child is shameless. Zarathustra does not claim we get rid of this shame outright by just denying it. No. For someone who carries pity, which ultimately points to a self-pity, the problem is that one should actually cultivate a shame for this pity, to overcome this pity firstly. What exactly is pity then? Well, pity is a looking back to the horrors of the past and a looking down in the present. A looking down that does not want to reconcile with actuality, but clings to the horrors of the present to ossify one's identity, clings to the horrors of the past to ossify one's identity in the present. This is a clinging to heaviness. Shame, as we have seen from the previous slides, is a looking away, a covering over of the face in the face of naked truth, of its traumatic nature, of the strength of self-reflection, of the fall of mankind as the genesis of spirit. The point here, according to Zarathustra, is that we can, in fact, turn shame against pity and against self-pity. That would mean going from the shame of pity to the shame for pity. That is, we can conceptualize it in the following formula. We must look away from looking back and down. We must look forward and up. Now, if we get the understanding of the fall of mankind and the genesis of spirit, what does Zarathustra have to say about original sin and eating from the tree of knowledge? Zarathustra does agree that we have original sin, but it is not eating from the tree of life. He says, "Verily, I have done some things for the suffering, but something better I always seem to do when I learned to look forward in excitement better. Since there have been men, man has looked forward in excitement too little. That alone, brethren, is our original sin. And as we learn to look forward in excitement better, we learn best to stop hurting others and inventing pain. For that I saw the afflicted suffer, I was ashamed of his shame, and when I helped him, I badly hurt his pride." So first of all, in the face of negativity and seeing this other suffer, yes, one can help the other, but according to Zarathustra, one should better look forward in excitement to inspire the other in a truthful way, for the other not to cling to the past. This looking forward in excitement is not a fleeing from the present, but a being grounded in a reconciliation with the present to cheer oneself up about the possibilities in the future. And the lack of this looking forward in excitement is in fact, according to Zarathustra, our original sin. And if we can attain this looking forward in excitement, this is the way in which we can stop hurting others and inventing pain. Because seeing that others suffer and either helping him or not helping him creates a negative spiral of shame, where the other has shame for his shame for his suffering. We carry shame for our shame for his shame, and pity that makes this suffering contagious. The way that we can deal with original sin is to look forward in excitement. If that is original sin, what about the devil? Zarathustra says, "And when I saw my devil, there I found him, earnest, thorough, deep, and somber. It was the spirit of heaviness. Through him all things fall. Not by wrath does one kill, but by laughing. Up, let us kill the spirit of heaviness." According to Zarathustra, the devil is the spirit of heaviness. And this spirit of heaviness carries its heaviness by having this earnest, thorough, deep, and somber nature. It does not allow laughter. It does not allow for lightness. It does not allow for childlike innocence. It deems it to be guilty of not being able to see the truth of the suffering of the past as well as the present. We cannot kill this spirit of heaviness by wrath, but only by laughing, by going into the lightness, going into the comical nature of our tragic lives. This is the way that we kill the spirit of heaviness. Finally, how do we overcome pity? Zarathustra says the following: "Courage is the best murderer. Courage also kills pity, but pity is the deepest abyss. As deep as man looks into life, so deeply does he look into suffering. But courage is the best murderer. Courage that attacks. It kills even death, because he says, 'Is this life? Well then, one more time.'" According to Zarathustra, to look, and what I've said in my previous slides, to be able to look forward in excitement, to be able to look away from looking back and looking down, is the cultivation of courage, which is the way that we kill pity. This lightness that I've talked about previously, this laughter by which we kill the spirit of heaviness, also takes courage, since to cling to the tragedy of life, we actually push away courage, since we ossify our own identity and cling to the seeming fact that we cannot go beyond tragedy. But we can. We can kill the spirit of heaviness with laughter, and we can kill pity with courage. And in all of this, on our way to the becoming of the spirit child, we must retain the youngest virtue, which is excessive spiritual honesty. Zarathustra says, "They call you heartless, but your heart is honest, and I hold the shame for your heartfulness dear. You are ashamed of your flood. Others are ashamed of their ebb. With rage they hate the knowing ones, and that youngest of virtues, which is called honesty. All of the work and the education of spirit, which is on the way to the becoming of the spirit child, the birth of the spirit child, needs to be in touch with the youngest virtue, which is the excessiveness of spiritual honesty. Naturally, we would be ashamed of this flood, and in the becoming of artists, spiritual or religious leaders, or philosophers, we must overcome this being ashamed of our flood and being able to channel our artistic energy and power in the right way, which is up to you in your own life. The others, which do not have this youngest virtue, which do not have this excessive spiritual honesty, are ashamed of their ebb, the fact that they cannot muster up the courage to kill pity, the fact that they cannot kill the spirit of heaviness by means of laughing. Lastly, how do we overcome this shame? Zarathustra says, we must not want to enjoy where we don't give enjoyment, and we must not want to enjoy. Enjoyment and innocence, you see, are the most shameful things. Both do not want to be sought. One should have them, but one should sooner seek guilt and suffering. In the work and education of spirit, with its telos as the birth of the spirit child, we should not merely go into the enjoyment, go into innocence, and try to attain shamelessness by looking away from guilt and suffering. No, it is the opposite. Those things are the most shameful, and we should have them, but we should not directly seek them. We can only attain them through a detour. And how do we go about this detour? First of all, we must always share that enjoyment and innocence and inspire the other by looking forward in excitement better. But we should also seek our guilt and seek our suffering. And this means that we must not obfuscate it, and that we must keep in touch with our youngest virtue to be able to reflect about that suffering, about that shame, about that pity. We will make mistakes onto the becoming of the spirit child. And this is something that we have to be honest about. Whenever we feel guilty, we feel shameful, we feel suffering, we should not look over this as if it's nothing. It is exactly by coming into contact with the truth of our heaviness, of our being under the reign of the spirit of heaviness, it is by coming into contact with that we are actually working and educating ourselves onto the becoming of the spirit child. Now, what exactly is the nature of this spirit child? And what about its creativity? Zarathustra says, I only love the land of my children, the undiscovered children's land in the farthest sea. To that land I let my sails search continuously. To my children I will make amends for being a child of my fathers, and, to all futures, this present. Where is innocence? Where the will to create is. And whoever wants to create beyond himself has the purest will. Now we finally understand that the looking forward and up, mustering up that courage, staying in touch with the youngest virtue, going beyond original sin, killing the devil, i.e. the spirit of heaviness, means to cheer to the future, the present that we are in right now. And this innocence is not a seeking of enjoyment and pleasure, definitely not in a sensuous manner, but to work and educate ourselves in spirit, to seek that guilt out. We can emerge on the other end by creating our own world, creating beyond ourselves. That definitely also entails a dissatisfaction with the incompleteness of the present. The child is this incompletion of the present as the will to create beyond oneself as a completion itself. Or, in other words, as an enjoyment of a self-turning wheel. So, to summarize, the spirit child is completely innocent. It cheers this present to the future. It is innocent in its having a pure will to create beyond oneself. And for this creation, as a game, it requires to have a holy yes saying towards this present. It forgets does not cling to the horrors of the past, to the tragic nature of actuality, but allows itself to be a new beginning, to be a game of creation. And in this, it is a self-turning wheel, it is a first movement. It is a spirit that wills its own will in a circulatory manner, as what psychoanalysis would later call drive. And those who are on their way to the becoming of the spirit child are worldless ones. They have been pushed out and they have been hated because they are the ones who carry the excess of spiritual honesty, or as Zarathustra would say, the youngest virtue. However, this drives them to create their own world, and there's nothing more beautiful than this. There is a deep homology between the creativity of the spirit child and the freedom of what Hegel calls the self-concept in the lectures on logic, as well as in his other mature works. He says, subjugation to necessity is the hardest subjugation of all. Within it, what rules is the relation of violence, of passing outside oneself, of self-negation. But to think necessity is to dissolve its hardness, and this is emancipation. The abstract emancipation of Indian hermits or the heroes of antiquity is no longer in question here. True emancipation is to be and remain by oneself, at home with oneself, in all that is different from oneself. Emancipation is the I, the pure self-concept itself. A concept, of course, can be a concept of something or other, of something external, but at that point the self-concept is caught up in the forms of externality, and is not yet for itself in simple self-reference. Spirit is free in that it is at home with itself in being at home with the I, and there we have the fullest form of freedom. According to Hegel, the necessity of the present is the hardest subjugation of all. But to think the hardness of the subjugation is to dissolve it, and this is emancipation. This allows one to be free in actuality, as oneself, as a new beginning, a new game. And this, according to Hegel, is the fullest form of freedom. It is a freedom that sees itself everywhere, a spirit that sees itself everywhere, even in that which is its seeming other. He continues on to say, thus spirit relates purely to itself and is therefore free. For freedom is precisely this, to be at home with oneself in one's other, to be dependent upon oneself, to be the determining factor for oneself. In all my urges, I start from something other than myself, that is for me something external. Here then, we speak of dependence. Freedom exists only where there is no other for me that I am not myself. The natural human being, who is determined only by his urges, is not at home with himself. However self-willed he may be, the content of his willing and believing is still not his own, and his freedom is merely a formal one. When I think, I give up my subjective particularity, immerse myself in the basic matter, and let thought follow its own course, and I think badly whenever I add something of my own. Now this, of course, is an extremely packed quote, and what is essential here that we can see that even though that the natural child might be touching, it is completely led by its urges, and therefore the freedom of the spirit child, the freedom of spirit, is a true kind of freedom, a freedom that is not dependent, a freedom where there is no other for myself, that I am not myself. This requires the work and education of spirit, be able to rise above the senses into the realm of pure thought, And this is one of the arguments that studying the science of logic is an important task in the work and the education of spirit onto the becoming of the spirit child. Hegel also says, thus, for example, the concept of freedom, insofar as it is a mere concept of the understanding, is freedom considered as the abstract opposite of necessity, while the true and rational concept of freedom contains in itself necessity as sublated. Freedom is therefore not merely the opposite of necessity, as the understanding would have it, always trying to flee its necessity and positing abstract freedoms as way to flee actuality. No, freedom is a perspectival shift on necessity, a perspectival shift on the subjugation and constraints of necessity that do not negate one's freedom, but are the conditions of possibility for the future of free self-creation. And Nietzsche says that the spirit child is a game of self-creation. Here Hegel says, the idea is this game of differentiating oneself from oneself, and thus falling into finitude by virtue of this differentiation. The idea is the activity of forever carrying out finitude into execution. Now, what is apparent in this quote is that which does the differentiating oneself from oneself is the idea, a spirit, the free self-concept, or the I. Therefore, there is no other that is not myself in this game of differentiation. To summarize, the free self-concept. Emancipation is to dissolve the hardness of subjugation to necessity, to be and remain by oneself, at home with oneself, in all that is different from oneself, as that which is oneself. This, according to Hegel, is the fullest form of freedom. And in this form of freedom, spirit is relating to itself. It is at home with oneself, in one's other. It is a self-determining freedom, a freedom that is not dependent on urges. Freedom is where there is no other for me that is not myself. The deep homology that I have found between Hegel's free self-concept and Nietzsche's creative spirit child is, on the one hand, the reconciliation with actuality that allows for the birth of a new life form, be it a new natural child or a new creative spirit child. Hegel mostly emphasizes the freedom of necessity, or necessity as freedom, to reconcile with the past and the present, whereas Zarathustra emphasizes the hardness of creation and wants to look up and above to the future. Hegel's freedom is a for itself as a circle. Nietzsche's freedom is a spirit willing its own will, again as that which psychoanalysis would call drive. For Hegel, spirit must be at home with self in its other to be free. For Nietzsche, the game of creation requires a holy yes saying. Hegel, on the other hand, would call this a game of differentiation, which is happening within oneself, with one's other, as that other being oneself. I have used the theory that I've developed in my paper to continue my artistic projects. Right now I'm writing rap music, and my debut single God's Love under the name Objet Lil A is out now. You can hear it on Spotify. The lyrics are as an interlude in the anthology, and this song has mostly been inspired by Nietzsche, Eckhart, and Christian mysticism, Lacan, as well as Zizek, and there's more songs on the way. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked this video, get the book. You can read my paper, which goes more in depth in the theory that I've developed, as well as read the other papers in the anthology. It's really a feat that this has been achieved, and it's very exciting to see where the future will take us in this project. So thanks again for watching. Shout out to Philosophy Portal, and see you in the next video. I live without a why, too slim down that nothing slide. The jitter I shiver don't hit her, no time to be alive. Got no shame, no generalize, you got no ground to stand on. Why must be the weakness, your demise. I win, move on and look right. No food, I'm off the pills, no water, just skills. The spirit, I've got it, chill, do it but stop it. No food, I'm off the pills, no water, just skills. The spirit, I've got it, the symptom, enjoy it.